Credium in senza di te languisce il cor.
Okay. Welcome to the match between Mr. Stanis and Mr. Redondo. We're going to be observing their chess game, but before we start, we're going to introduce the pieces. First is the pawn. Mr. Redondo, it can move 1 forward, or it can move 2 if it's on its starting square. Okay, Mr. Stanis, you might want to do this one. Next is the rook. It can move anywhere side to side or forward and back. And next is the knight. The knight can move in an L-shaped direction anywhere. It's the only piece that can jump over any other pieces of any other color. And next is the bishop. That is diagonal, as Mr. Stanis is showing. Pretty self-explanatory, and bishops can only stay on their square the whole game, their own color. And then it's the king. The king is the objective of the game. If you can get the king where a piece is threatening it, meaning it can take it, so if, say there's a bishop here, it can take it on its next move. If all the pieces, if the king can't move anywhere because all the pieces are threatening it, then you win the game. That's called checkmate. The last piece is the queen. It can move basically anywhere a rook can move, and a bishop combined, diagonally and back and forth, front and back. Okay, so some special moves that you can do is castling. Castling is when there's no pieces between the rook and the king, yes, as he's showing it, and they haven't moved the whole game yet, and they can switch. It's a good way to get your rook into the game and to get your king to safety. Now, as the game goes on, I'll explain what's happening, but as of right now, we'll just watch. Okay, ready? Put on your headphones. And let's go. First pawn move, 2 squares. Now, a pawn can take diagonally. So, Mr. Redondo just defended his pawn. The knight moves in an L shape, 3 squares forward, 1 square right or left. Another pawn move. Bishops go diagonal. Castles. Defending the pawn with another pawn because they can go diagonally. So the main objective of the first few moves is to get the bishops and the knights off their starting square. Right now they are effectively doing this, and they're going for the center, which is where you really should aim for in playing chess. Okay, this is called developing, moving your bishops and your knights. More developing. Not really any fire going. Castling. Again, getting the rook into the game out of its starting square and getting the king to safety. Pawn, 2 moves, 2 squares forward. Now, Mr. Redondo has a chance to take that knight using his knight. And yeah, using his knight, he can take it because he's right at an L with the knight. And Mr. Redondo takes with his knight, and Mr. Stanis takes back with his pawn. Now, I think that was the first trade of the game, and if there's more trades, then we might be able to see the board clear up. Okay, that pawn move by Mr. Redondo, we can assume it was to protect a pawn. And Mr. Stanis just protected his pawn too. Okay, pressure on that one pawn in the center. Mr. Redondo threatened it with his knight, and Mr. Stanis put even more pressure with his rook. As we said before, rooks can go forward and backward and side to side. Okay, queen is now on the side of Mr. Stanis's king, and more pressure, or more like a pawn break, is trying to be started in the center. Meaning he's trying to just clear out the center of the board, and it might be a totally different game when all the trades are done. By the way, trades are just when one person takes a piece and the other person takes the piece that captured the piece back. Usually it means that the pieces on the board remain an equal quality. Okay, another pawn push. Mr. Stanis seems to be breaking it with his pawns, just pushing it one after the other and taking whatever's in its path. And as we said, pawns can take diagonally to the forward. Oh. Yep, bishop was threatened by the pawn. Mr. Stanis just pushed, and Mr. Redondo retreats. Okay, queen maneuvered and slided so that it is directly, almost, in line with the king. And in the heat of all this, Mr. Stanis pushes his queen across the board to capture a knight. So, as of that, Mr. Stanis is winning the game because he took a knight, and Mr. Redondo, and he is now a knight up than Mr. Redondo. Okay, Mr. Redondo defends the pawn that Mr. Stanis might have took on his next turn. As you can see, the game is morphing into more of just breaking everything apart and taking what you can. But either way, Mr. Stanis is winning at the moment. We can also see that Mr. Redondo's pawns on his king side are very scattered. And that means that it might become a weakness now in the future, and there's basically no one to protect the king. And this spreading of pawns could be a weakness in the future and lead to the end game, and lead as a more, in a more understandable term, it might lead to the end of the game. Okay, another pawn push. Mr. Redondo's bishop is in danger. So the pieces that started off on the very end of the board are more valuable than the pawns. So when Mr. Stanis pushes these pawns, it's definitely a good thing to move it out of the way. It's not something that you should probably sacrifice unless you already have a critical plan in your head. Okay, Queen is joining in on the fight. And it is also pinning its own knight. So right now, what could happen is Mr. Stanis can move his knight to threaten Mr. Redondo's rook. And since that is a check, then Mr. Stanis can win the rook for free and just wear away at Mr. Redondo's structure and pieces. Although there still is a little bit of a threat on how the queen is on the king side of Mr. Stanis. So if Mr. Redondo can get his other pieces to aim at the king on the other side of the board, then he might have a chance to win his knight back. Okay, rook move, slides it over one, and Mr. Stanis blocks the pawn from going anywhere. Blocks Mr. Redondo's move. Sorry, Mr. Stanis blocks Mr. Redondo's pawn from going anywhere, and we have a few pawn trades. Well, maybe not. Mr. Stanis undoes his move with his queen before, and again pins his knight. So in this position again, Mr. Stanis can make a fork. Actually, there's another fork. He can fork his queen and his king, which basically just means he threatens his king and his queen both. And Mr. Redondo loses one of them. And obviously it has to be with the queen, because if he loses his king, then game over. Mr. Redondo blocks with his rook. Again, there's still a fork that can be done. A knight is significantly less valuable than a queen. Okay, rook move. Everyone's pressuring in on Mr. Redondo's king. If Mr. Stanis can maneuver this right, then he might have a mate within his grasp in a few moves. All his pieces are on, most of his pieces at least, are on his queen side, on his king side, I'm sorry. Okay, Mr. Stanis retreats his rook, and actually Mr. Redondo loses his rook and trades his rook, actually. I'm sorry. Okay, check. Mr. Redondo can only now move. Yeah, there. And that was the fork. Yep, that was the fork. And it's check again. And Mr. Redondo can either move diagonally forward or diagonally right or diagonally left. Actually, yes, he can only move diagonally at the moment, I don't think. Hesitating by Mr. Stanis. Oh, and pawn push. This threatens the rook. Also, if a pawn makes it to the other side, it can become a queen, which is a major role to play in a game. So if Mr. Stanis' pawn moves one more square forward, it can become a queen, and that's a huge advantage for Mr. Stanis. Let's check.
Let's check again.
Mr. Stanis' queen is able to threaten.
But what is that tall one?
Which tall one?
The one that Mr. Stanis just moved.
That's the queen.
Yeah.
Mr. Stanis' queen is staring dead at Mr. Redondo's king, which is
Not good.
definitely not good. There's a lot of hanging pieces here. That just means that a lot of pieces are undefended and can be taken at any time. Well, during the duration of the game. Mr. Redondo's thinking. This, I believe, he can only move to the sideways. If you're, yes, there, or the other way. You could have moved the other way. Check. Ooh, that might. Is that?
You're asking me? I have no idea what's going on.
That might be mate. Is that mate?
Still green?
Oh no. Mr. Redondo can block and then I believe it's mate. I don't think he has a choice though.
What? Is the block?
He has to block, yeah. But after
After he blocks, then Mr. Stanis make another move.
After he blocks, Mr. Stanis takes, and then Mr. Redondo has to block again with the bishop, and then I believe it might be mate. Mr. Stanis might win this game if, well, I think it's forced. Mr. Redondo has no choice. He has to block with the bishop, and then mate, I believe.
Vincerò! Vincerò! Vincerò!
Congratulations to Mr. Stanis for his victory on this year's OLG Spring Chess Showdown.